I'd never imagined the day would come when my husband would look me in the eyes and tell me our marriage was over. But what shocked me even more was the confidence on his face. Gavin truly believed I'd break down, beg him to stay, and promise to become whatever he wanted. Instead, I quietly packed one suitcase, walked out the front door, and within 6 months he had lost his company, his reputation, his mansion, and every person he thought would choose him over me. The part that still keeps him awake at night? None of it happened because I took revenge. It happened because he never realized I was the only thing holding his entire life together. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. My name is Bryn Hale, and for 12 years I believed that love meant standing by your spouse through every hardship. I kept telling myself that loyalty, patience, and sacrifice would eventually fix what was broken between us. Gavin Mercer saw things differently. The more I gave, the more certain he became that I would never leave, no matter how little appreciation or respect I received. So when he placed divorce papers in front of me that evening, he wore the smile of a man convinced he had already won. He waited for tears, arguments, or desperate promises. Instead, I slipped off my wedding ring, placed it beside the papers, wished him the life he wanted, and walked away without looking back. He laughed as the door closed behind me, completely unaware that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. When Gavin and I first met, there was nothing glamorous about our lives. He had a big dream of building his own business, but he also had mounting debt, unpaid invoices, and more determination than resources. I believed in him completely, so I never questioned the sacrifices we had to make. I worked long hospital shifts that often left me exhausted, yet every evening I came home and opened his company books. While he focused on finding clients, I managed the accounting, balanced budgets, negotiated with vendors, corrected payroll mistakes, and answered late-night emails from worried investors. Whenever the business ran short of cash, I quietly covered our household expenses from my personal savings so Gavin could keep chasing his dream without another burden on his shoulders. As the company slowly grew, people began treating Gavin like a self-made success story. They admired his confidence and congratulated him for building everything from the ground up. I stood beside him at celebrations, smiling while accepting none of the credit. Friends would laugh and tell me how fortunate I was to be married to such a successful entrepreneur, never realizing how many sleepless nights and personal sacrifices had made that success possible. Gavin eventually started believing the same version of the story everyone else did. He stopped seeing me as his partner and began viewing my support as something he was entitled to. The gratitude disappeared, replaced by expectation. Every problem I solved became invisible because he assumed it would always be handled. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't simply supporting his dream, I was carrying far more of it than either of us was willing to admit. Success changed Gavin so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. The man who used to wear faded jeans and dream with me over cheap takeout suddenly cared about designer suits, exclusive restaurants, and impressing people with money. Family dinners became business events, weekends disappeared into networking trips, and conversations between us grew shorter with every passing month. Then he hired a polished executive named Sloane Carter. He described her as someone who understood the demands of a growing company, so I didn't think much of it at first. But before long, there were late-night meetings that couldn't wait until morning, phone calls he stepped outside to answer, and messages he quickly hid whenever I walked into the room. When I finally asked if something was going on between them, Gavin acted offended. He accused me of being insecure and paranoid, making me question my own instincts. For weeks I tried to believe him because trusting my husband felt easier than accepting the truth. But emotional distance soon became impossible to ignore. He barely looked at me anymore, and every conversation ended with me apologizing for problems I hadn't created. One evening, he finally stopped pretending. Without an ounce of guilt, he told me he deserved someone who fit the successful life he had built. According to him, I no longer belonged in that world. Instead of admitting his own choices had changed him, he blamed me for holding him back. Hearing those words was devastating, not because he had chosen someone else, but because he genuinely believed he had reached the top entirely on his own, forgetting every sacrifice that had helped him get there. A few days after admitting he wanted someone else, Gavin came home carrying a neatly organized folder. He placed it on the kitchen table without saying much, then sat across from me with the confidence of someone expecting a dramatic scene. Inside were divorce papers already prepared by his attorney. Everything had been planned before he ever spoke to me about ending our marriage. He leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully as I turned each page. I could almost feel him waiting for the tears, the pleading, or the desperate promises to change. Instead, I read every word slowly and carefully. When I reached the final page, I picked up the pen and signed my name without raising my voice or asking him to reconsider. The silence in the room seemed to surprise him more than any argument could have. He frowned, almost disappointed that I wasn't reacting the way he had imagined. He began making careless remarks, saying I would regret my decision, that life without him would be harder than I realized, and that I would eventually come asking for another chance. It felt less like a conversation and more like he was trying to force an emotional response. I looked at him one last time, slipped off my wedding ring, and placed it beside the signed papers. Then I quietly said, I hope your new life gives you everything you think you're looking for. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the front door without looking back. Gavin mistook my calm goodbye for surrender. What he didn't understand was that my heart had accepted the end of our marriage long before those divorce papers ever reached our kitchen table. Starting over at 38 wasn't something I had ever planned, but it was the reality I had to face. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't fancy, and I had to watch every dollar I spent, but for the first time in years, my home felt peaceful. There were no tense conversations, no waiting for someone to come home, and no constant feeling that I had to prove my worth. The silence that once seemed frightening quickly became comforting. Every morning, I reminded myself that rebuilding a life takes time, and I was finally building one that belonged to me. Not long after the divorce, I accepted a position in financial operations at a growing medical technology company. During the interview, my ideas were taken seriously, and my experience mattered. Within weeks, I was helping improve financial processes and solving problems that had frustrated the team for months. My coworkers respected my judgment and included me in important meetings. It felt strange at first to have people actually listen when I spoke instead of assuming someone else deserved the credit for my work. Little by little, the confidence I had lost during my marriage began to return. While I was quietly rebuilding my future, Gavin was busy celebrating what he called his fresh start. He spent money as though success would never end, taking expensive trips and making sure everyone believed he had come out ahead. Whenever people asked about our divorce, he acted as if I had relied on him for everything. I never corrected the story. I knew the truth didn't need defending. Eventually, life has a way of revealing who was truly carrying the weight all along. A few months after our divorce, I began hearing small pieces of news about Gavin's company through former coworkers and mutual acquaintances. At first, the problems sounded minor. Employees were complaining that paychecks had been delayed because of payroll mistakes. Vendors who had worked with the company for years were suddenly demanding payment before shipping supplies. Important contracts that normally would have been finalized on time were sitting unfinished, creating unnecessary delays. Then tax notices started arriving, and simple bookkeeping errors grew into expensive problems that could no longer be ignored. None of it surprised me. During our marriage, I had quietly handled those responsibilities behind the scenes. I stayed late balancing accounts, caught financial mistakes before they became serious, and maintained professional relationships that kept the business running smoothly. Gavin rarely noticed because the problems disappeared before they reached his desk. Now there was no one left to prevent those small issues from growing into major setbacks. Instead of asking why everything was falling apart, Gavin blamed his employees. He accused his accounting team of being careless and insisted that people simply weren't working hard enough. The frustration inside the office continued to grow, and experienced staff members began resigning one after another. As more people left, the remaining employees struggled to keep up with the workload. The company's financial reports became weaker each quarter, causing investors to question whether the business was still stable. Confidence slowly faded, but Gavin refused to consider that the foundation of his success had never been built by one person alone. Even as the cracks spread through every part of the company, he still couldn't admit that the partner he dismissed had quietly been holding everything together for years. While Gavin struggled to understand why his company was slipping away, my own career was finally moving in a direction I had never allowed myself to imagine. At the medical technology company, I was given the freedom to solve problems instead of simply keeping them hidden. I reviewed outdated financial systems, streamlined reporting procedures, and renegotiated several costly vendor agreements that had been draining the company's budget for years. Within a few months, the leadership team announced that the changes had saved the company millions of dollars. I wasn't looking for recognition, but this time my work couldn't be overlooked. Soon after, I was promoted to lead the financial operations department. My opinion was requested during executive meetings, and colleagues trusted my judgment when difficult decisions had to be made. Business partners who had worked with us began asking for my input because they appreciated my practical approach and calm way of handling challenges. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely respected for my own abilities rather than for the success of someone standing beside me. As my confidence returned, I started seeing my past more clearly. I realized I had never lacked intelligence, skill, or determination. I had simply spent years putting my energy into helping someone else succeed while convincing myself that staying in the background was enough. That chapter of my life was over. I no longer introduced myself as Gavin Mercer's former wife or attached my identity to his achievements. I was simply Bryn Hale, a trusted financial professional whose experience, steady leadership, and quiet determination earned respect on their own. That realization was worth far more than any promotion or paycheck could ever provide. About 8 months after our divorce, I received a phone call from a number I hadn't seen in a long time. It was Gavin. His voice sounded different, missing the confidence he had carried the day I walked away. He asked if we could meet for coffee, saying there were things he needed to say in person. Out of respect for the years we had shared, I agreed to a brief meeting at a quiet cafe after work. At first, the conversation sounded sincere. Gavin admitted he had made mistakes and apologized for the way our marriage had ended. He said he had been arrogant and taken me for granted. I listened without interrupting because I had already made peace with the past. Then the reason for the meeting slowly became clear. He explained that the company was facing serious financial challenges and asked if I would review the books just one last time. He insisted that no one understood the business the way I did and said I had always been the person who could fix impossible situations. I looked at him calmly and thanked him for the apology, but I told him I couldn't help. My decision wasn't made out of anger or revenge. That chapter of my life had ended the day I walked out of our house. The company was no longer my responsibility, and neither were the problems created after I left. Gavin stared at me in disbelief, unable to understand why I wasn't stepping in to rescue him like I always had before. He eventually walked away convinced I was being bitter. The truth was much simpler. Some lessons can only be learned when no one is left to shield you from the consequences of your own decisions. After I declined to help, Gavin's situation continued to unravel. Several longtime clients decided not to renew their contracts, explaining that they no longer felt the company provided the same level of reliability they had once trusted. Many of those relationships had been built through years of careful communication and consistent follow-through behind the scenes. Without realizing it, Gavin had underestimated how much those clients valued the steady work I had done long before he took all the credit. The financial pressure quickly spread. Banks that had once approved loans with little hesitation began demanding additional guarantees before extending more credit. Suppliers who had previously offered flexible payment terms now required money upfront, unwilling to take further risks. Cash flow became unpredictable, forcing Gavin to make difficult choices every month just to keep the business operating. Outside the office, the lifestyle he had proudly shown off started slipping away. The luxury vacations stopped. The expensive dinners became rare. Eventually, the large house he had insisted on keeping after our divorce was listed for sale because the payments were no longer manageable. One by one, the high-end cars disappeared from the driveway. Sloane, who had once seemed inseparable from him, gradually stepped back as the financial problems grew. She found reasons to stay busy and eventually ended the relationship altogether. The friends who had crowded his home during successful times also became strangely unavailable. Phone calls went unanswered, invitations stopped arriving, and the support he expected never came. For the first time, Gavin understood that many of the people around him had been attracted to his success, not to the person he truly was. Loyalty, he finally realized, couldn't be bought or replaced. Several months later, my company sent me to a healthcare leadership conference where executives, investors, and industry professionals gathered to discuss innovation and financial growth. I was there to represent our organization and speak about the improvements our team had made to strengthen long-term stability. It was an opportunity one had earned through hard work, and I felt proud walking into the conference wearing my company badge instead of standing quietly behind someone else. As I greeted colleagues in the lobby, I suddenly noticed a familiar face across the room. Gavin was there. From what I later learned, he had come hoping to attract new investors for his struggling business. The moment our eyes met, he seemed genuinely surprised. Before either of us could speak, several respected executives approached me, shook my hand warmly, and thanked me for helping solve financial challenges they had admired from a distance. Gavin stood silently, watching conversations unfold that he never expected to see. Later that afternoon, I gave a presentation about practical financial strategies, sustainable budgeting, and building trust through responsible leadership. I answered questions with confidence, sharing lessons I had learned through years of experience. The audience responded with genuine interest, and many stayed afterward to continue the discussion. As I glanced across the room, I noticed Gavin listening from the back, no longer wearing the certainty that had defined him for so long. For the first time since we met, he wasn't looking at me as the quiet wife who supported his career from the shadows. He was seeing the professional everyone else already recognized. In that moment, I think he finally understood that the intelligence, judgment, and leadership he had dismissed had always been real. He had simply chosen not to see it while we were married. A few days after the conference, Gavin called again. This time, there was no talk about business or finances. He simply asked if I would meet him for one last cup of coffee. After thinking about it, I agreed. We met at a small neighborhood cafe where we had once spent countless evenings dreaming about our future together. The memories were still there, but the emotions that had once tied me to them were gone. The moment Gavin sat down, I could see how much he had changed. The confidence that had once filled every conversation had been replaced by quiet regret. After a long silence, he admitted something I had never expected to hear. He told me I had been the reason everything in his life had worked for so many years. He confessed that he had mistaken my steady support for something ordinary and only realized my true value after I was gone. Looking down at his coffee, he apologized for taking me for granted and said that if he could relive those years, he would make different choices. I listened without interrupting. There was no anger left inside me because holding on to bitterness would only keep me connected to a chapter one had already closed. When he finished, I thanked him for being honest and accepted his apology. Then I gently told him something he needed to hear. Forgiveness didn't mean we could start over. Trust is built through years of consistent actions, but it can be destroyed much faster. Once it's broken again and again, it cannot simply be restored because life becomes lonely or difficult. Some mistakes become permanent lessons, and ours was one of them. After my final conversation with Gavin, I stopped looking back. There was nothing left to fix, explain, or wonder about. My energy belonged to the life I was building, not the one I had left behind. I focused on my career with renewed purpose, taking on new challenges and continuing to grow professionally. Each accomplishment reminded me that I was capable of creating a future on my own terms. I also reached out to friends I had unintentionally drifted away from during my marriage. Over the years, I had been so consumed with supporting Gavin and his business that many important relationships had quietly faded. Reconnecting with people who genuinely cared about me brought laughter and comfort back into my life. They didn't see me as someone's wife or expect me to solve their problems. They simply valued my friendship, and that meant more than I had realized. As my confidence grew, I achieved milestones I had once thought were impossible. I bought my own home, a place that reflected my personality and gave me a sense of stability. Whenever I had time, I traveled to places I had always wanted to visit and picked up hobbies I had abandoned years earlier because I was too busy putting someone else's dreams first. Those simple experiences reminded me how much of myself I had forgotten. For the first time in many years, I measured success by my own happiness instead of someone else's accomplishments. The loneliness I had once feared never arrived. In its place came peace, independence, and quiet confidence. Looking back, I realized leaving my marriage hadn't destroyed my life. It had given me the opportunity to finally discover the woman I had been all along, waiting patiently beneath years of sacrifice. About a year after our divorce, I heard the news that Gavin's company had officially filed for bankruptcy. It wasn't a rumor or another temporary setback this time. After months of declining profits and failed attempts to recover, several investors had withdrawn their support, leaving the business without the resources it needed to survive. Soon afterward, the few partners who had remained loyal resigned, choosing to move on rather than continue fighting a battle they no longer believed could be won. The company Gavin had once been so proud of quietly came to an end. I didn't celebrate when I heard what had happened. Despite everything we had been through, watching someone's dream collapse wasn't something that brought me happiness. I simply accepted it as the natural consequence of years of choices that had slowly led him there. Through mutual acquaintances, I later learned that Gavin had become much more reflective. For the first time, he admitted that I had never tried to control his life or take credit for his achievements. Instead, I had supported him through every difficult season, solving problems before they became disasters and standing beside him when no one else believed in his vision. He finally understood that many of the successes he proudly claimed had been possible because we had built them together. Losing his wealth and business was painful, but those losses eventually became secondary. His deepest regret was realizing too late that the one person who had genuinely believed in him had walked away forever. By the time he understood my worth, I had already created a peaceful, fulfilling life where he was no longer part of the future I was building. Today, people occasionally ask me how I managed to get revenge on my ex-husband after everything he put me through. My answer always surprises them because I never set out to ruin his life. I didn't make secret plans, fight with him in court, or try to destroy his career. The truth is much simpler. I stopped protecting a man who no longer appreciated the person standing beside him. Once I stepped away, the responsibilities I had quietly carried for years became impossible for him to ignore. The truth revealed itself without me having to prove anything. Looking back now, I understand that kindness can sometimes be misunderstood. When you constantly solve problems, make sacrifices, and ask for nothing in return, some people begin to believe that's simply your role. They stop noticing your efforts because they assume you'll always be there. It isn't until that support disappears that they realize how much they depended on it. If my story has taught me anything, it's that love should never require you to lose your identity. Loyalty is valuable, but it should never come at the cost of your self-respect. A healthy relationship is built on appreciation, honesty, and mutual effort, not on one person carrying all the weight while the other takes the credit. So if you're listening to my story and feeling trapped in a situation where your kindness is met with disrespect, remember this. Walking away doesn't always mean you've failed. Sometimes it's the bravest decision you'll ever make. Sometimes the ending you fear becomes the beginning you truly need. The day I left wasn't the day my life fell apart. It was the day I finally became the main character in my own story.